Welcome to the channel, guys. My name is Will, and today I want to talk to you guys about some New World lore. So, kind of in more of a discussion format. I kind of want to talk about them, kind of give my opinion on some of the things, my take on what we've learned. And I kind of came about making this video because I spent a lot of time, post level 60 doing a bunch of stuff. Kind of found myself a little more curious about what's going on, like what's happening out there. Why are the things we're doing? Why are we doing them? Because like a lot of other people, I kind of breezed through a lot of the story, paid attention to little bits here and there, but kind of breezed through it, trying to get to the end game so we can do the great end game stuff that we ended up finding out wasn't really there. So I decided to take some time, go back, learn more about the game, figure some stuff out. And as I was doing my research, going on YouTube, reading articles, things like that, I found that there wasn't really a good overarching analysis of what's happening in the world. It was basically series upon series of 3 to 4 minute videos that covered little snippets, this piece and this piece and this piece. So you're kind of having to pick and pull all this information from all over the place. So I decided to put together this compendium. 4 races we're going to talk about, the 4 different factions we're going to talk about. So not 3 like you're used to. There's a 4th faction that's even more interesting than the 3 you can join. And then also a little bit about what's our purpose in Aeternum, what are we doing as players. So I want to jump right in by talking to you guys about the 4 different races. So the first part of this video is going to be covering the 4 different races of Aeternum. So not necessarily even races, there's 4 different beings, the 4 different types of existences we kind of interact with around the world. And the first one is going to be probably the most important, not my favorite, but the most important in terms of future content and having a better understanding of what's going on. And that's the Ancients. So based on information we've gathered through the game, through different NPCs, the archaeologists and the scholars, the Ancients are one of 2 things. So they're either like a progenitor race, so they've basically always existed in Aeternum, or they're like an alien race that came to Aeternum and were attracted to what's happening here because of Azoth. And Azoth is a very important material in the game. It mechanically does a lot of things, but also lore-wise is very important. What it is, kind of in the gist, is the life force of Aeternum is the best way to look at it. So if you're a Final Fantasy VII player, it's kind of like the life stream, more or less, where it's like the life force of Aeternum. It gives us our powers. It allows us to wield magic. It's the reason why we respawn when we die. It's the reason why the trees regrow. All the animals we kill come back. It's the reason why everything exists and continues to exist in Aeternum. Because Azoth itself will not let you die. You cannot die from Azoth, and in fact, because of that, one of the last race we're going to talk about has a very pitiful existence, and it sucks to be that. So, but that type of material is fascinated the Ancients. Again, whether they're progenitors or aliens or whatever it is, it caused them to do a lot of experimentation, to study it, to learn about it, to do a lot of things, to interact with it. And because of that, the Ancients, even though they existed millennia ago, I mean, like, we're talking thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, they were far more advanced than we are technologically. They were able to build structures that we wouldn't be able to. They were able to power certain types of equipment that we weren't able to. They were able to do all these things that we can't. So they're very Egyptian-esque in terms of how they operate, because just like the ancient Egyptians, they were able to build the pyramids and things and do all these things that there's no way they should have physically been able to do. The Ancients are very similar. But because of all this experimentation and messing around, they created or discovered, again, something we're not very sure of, a kind of reoccurring theme throughout here is because Aeternum, in terms of human occupation, is still very young. I mean, there's humans that have been here for millennia, thousands of years now, but just like us, it's been thousands of years and we still barely know anything about ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations. They're still learning, and a lot of the information we gather is speculation. So whether it's about the Ancients or any of the other races we're going to talk about, a lot of it's speculation in terms of exactly how and when and stuff like that. But regardless of all that, the Ancients were believed to either have uncovered or created the corruption. And the corruption is kind of another one of the races. I do the parentheses because they're not technically a race, but we'll cover that under their section. But they created or uncovered the corruption, which forced them to then create a new life form themselves, using the power of Azoth, because they have that kind of capability, called Ancient Guardians. So the skeletal figures we interact with around Aeternum were actually created by the Ancients in response to the corruption, to defend them against the corruption. Obviously, they were not successful because Ancients are either completely wiped out or they fled Aeternum. So whenever you see those kind of skeletal figures floating around there, you're always going to find them in the ruins or like in the monoliths. They were created by the ancients to defend them against the corruption, and that they still persist to this day, defending their territory. So that's kind of like a subspecies to the ancients, because they're kind of a life form created by them. We do know that the ancient guardians were created in Reekwater. Actually, the Lazarus dungeon you interact with is kind of the birthplace to the ancient guardians. So whatever that means, however they did that, that's kind of like their birthplace. That's their cradle of life, is that area. So that's going to be the ancient portion. Again, I'm going to try to keep these somewhat brief. I don't want them to be like incredibly long. Hopefully each one of these I can cover in just a few minutes and then kind of breeze through the rest of us. Again, I like to keep this video around 20 minutes or so for you guys, so I'm not just like melting your brains with info. But that's the ancients. Again, very mysterious race. They're the most important in terms of what's happening here in the world, so excited to learn more about them. And we're going to roll right off them into the corruption. So the corrupted are, again, they're some sort of life form that was created from the ancients interacting with Azoth and doing stuff with Azoth. So the corruption itself is not really a race so much as it is more of like a disease or a sickness that spreads throughout people and creatures and plant life and turns them into the corrupted. So they kind of become a new being once you become corrupted. You have weird corrupted powers. You don't quite look like yourself anymore. You're a little different. You have this insatiable hunger to spread the corruption, to corrupt more people. So it's kind of like being bitten by a zombie, becoming a zombie, and then being forced to, turn others into zombies. You're not really a human anymore, even though you are. It's kind of something like that. But the corruption itself affects people differently. So it's assumed that people with like stronger wills or stronger minds can not necessarily combat the corruption, but they're able to resist it to some extent and still maintain a sense of self. So, for example, the main villain we interact with, the main antagonist so far in the story, goes by the Tempest, and her name is Isabella, and she is still, for the most part, herself. She still has, the ability of speech and memory and all that kind of stuff, but she is also forced to serve the corruption, whether some sort of living being, like with a will of its own or not, we don't really know yet, but it's definitely described as some sort of disease or sickness that spreads amongst people and turns them into corrupted and forces them to spread the corruption. So that's pretty much the portion about the corruption. Not too much more to it. A good chunk of it's covered in the ancient portion, so we're going to go ahead and move directly on from that to what are called the Angry Earth. So the Angry Earth are actually my favorite of the races or species here in Aeternum that we interact with, and it's because they're almost like a being created by Aeternum for the defense of Aeternum. So there's a few different versions of them we're going to cover. The first one are the basic Angry Earth, and these are what appear in animal form. So these are like you see them as elk, or not elk, but like stags or bears or wolves, things like that. But they're made out of like tree bark and plant life, things like that, are kind of the idea with that. And they're thought of to basically have always existed as like caretakers, protectors of Aeternum in general. So they're kind of like the gardeners of Aeternum, and they kind of go around making sure that a balance is maintained within the space of Aeternum. And then there's a second version of the Angry Earth called the Druids, and those are the versions that are more humanoid. You have like the mushroom-bodied ones. They kind of look like people that were like covered in mushrooms. You have like the sword and board ones. You have the bow-wielding ones, and you have like the shaman-style ones. They're all more of a humanoid form, and those are believed to have been created directly in response to the corruption to protect Aeternum and fend off the corruption. And as far as we can tell and what we've learned, they've actually been very successful over the eons that they've been defending Aeternum from the corruption, because the druid forms themselves are actually incredibly skilled. They're very tactical, they fight in units, they fight as teams, and they're quite good at defending Aeternum as a whole. And because they're not technically alive, they don't fatigue, they don't tire, they don't do all that kind of stuff. They're kind of like the ancient guardians where they just persist eternally. Of course, everything in Aeternum lives forever, but even us as humans, we get fatigued, we get tired, we get worn out, whereas the ancient guardians and Angry Earth do not. So they're a very kind of elite fighting force designed by Aeternum itself, by Azoth, by the life force of Aeternum, to defend Aeternum against the corruption. And then there's a third form of them that are called the Blighted Angry Earth. And what those are versions of the Angry Earth, usually in humanoid form, that are affected by the corruption. So, being that they're not alive, they're not living creatures, they can't be corrupted the same way living creatures can. they are instead blighted, so they're more of like infected, like poisoned creatures. That's why in the game you interact with two different versions of, I guess, infections. You have the corruption and you have the blight. They're separate from each other. So that's what happens simply when an angry earth being becomes corrupted. They instead gain the blight. And that's kind of a general synopsis of what's going on with them. To me, they're very intriguing because they're kind of like they're a hive mind type being, but at the same time they're not. They are independent. They do have their own souls. Azoth, they were given souls through the power of Azoth. So they exist independently, but they're also like a hive existence. So I'm very interested in them. I'm very interested in learning more about them. So I'm excited to get more information going forward with them. And then the final one we're going to talk about is actually called the Lost. And as I mentioned before, this race is kind of very depressing. This is the type of race that you don't want to be, the type of existence you don't want to have. And that's because the Lost are basically you and I. They are people who arrive in Aeternum without a soul already. So because Aeternum won't let you die, it forces every being to come back to life, whether it's nature or humans or creatures. They all come back because of Azoth and that the life stream that is built into Aeternum. The people who arrive in Aeternum, so let's say their boat is wrecked at sea and they die and they wash up on the shore, they still have a physical body but no soul, so they come back as these husks, like these empty shells of themselves, and that's what are called the Lost. Now there's just like the Angry Earth, there are multiple forms of the Lost. The second form of the Lost are people, and this is even sadder than the first version, are people who exist in Aeternum who over the millennia kind of lose their sense of self. They lose their humanity because frankly humans aren't meant to live for thousands of years. In fact, your human brain can only maintain its memory for about a couple hundred years before it starts erasing old memories to replace them with new ones. So people who are more weak-willed or weak-minded lose their sense of self and become lost throughout time. And those versions of the Lost are the ones that you run into that are still, they seem pretty normal. You know, they still wield weapons. They walk around more normally. They don't seem as feral as the regular Lost. That's because they are still technically normal humans. They've just lost their soul over time. They've become hollow on the inside. And then there's a third form of the Lost, which are like the spectral beings. Those are the ones that are like the ghostly, ghastly figures. And it's described, and this is kind of confusing to me because the way Azoth works, it's supposed to bring you back to life no matter what, for all, always, and forever. These ones are described as beings that either arrived so incredibly mangled and disfigured that the body couldn't be restored, so they just kind of come back as like a ghostly figure, or like the specters that you see. Or they're beings that have been so repeatedly destroyed or disfigured or dismembered throughout their time in Aeternum, because again, you can't die. So whenever you're destroyed, you get a boulder that crushes you into nothingness, you come back still. But they're described as ones that have just been so brutally destroyed so many times that they lose their form and becomes like the spectral versions of themselves. That's going to be the last kind of race we're going to talk about. That's the Lost. They are by far the newest existence here in Aeternum, as far as we're aware of. And they have the least to do with everything else, lore-wise. They don't really care about the corruption. They don't care about the Angry Earth. They don't care about anything else. They're kind of their own existence that we interact with throughout the world. Again, they're us if we didn't have our soul anymore. It's pretty straightforward. So that's going to cover the race portion of this, beings or the existences we interact with in a tournament, and kind of what they mean and how they impact us as players and the world around us. And we're going to go ahead from there and jump directly into faction lore. So this segment actually won't be quite as long as the last section because pretty straightforward. We're going to kind of just cover the basic three factions, what their purpose is, what they're working towards, and then we're going to talk, the majority of it's going to be about the fourth faction, which we'll cover towards the end of this portion of the video. But the main three factions are going to be the Marauders, the Syndicate, and the Covenant. And they've all kind of formed around the same time, not exactly the same time, but they're pretty straightforward. Each of them have the same overarching purpose, the same reason for doing what they do, and they're looking to get to a point where they have a free and safe Aeternum that's free of the corruption, that's free of the blight, that's free of all these things that are putting the residents of Aeternum at risk. Because keeping in mind that like people don't die, you live forever. For a lot of people, an existence in Aeternum is hell. You know, it's dangerous. If you leave your settlement, you're at risk of being just brutally killed. And you feel pain, you feel death, you feel all of that, and then you come back and it all happens again. So they all have all three of them have the same core principles of creating a version of Aeternum that is basically a paradise. That's a heaven on earth type situation where you get to have your immortality and enjoy the whole aspect of it. So it's kind of like they want you to have your cake and eat it too type thing. But they all have different intentions for making this type of Aeternum happen. And we'll start out with covering the Marauders. So Marauders, pretty straightforward. They're kind of through the power of brute force, we will cleanse Aeternum of all evil and have a pure kind of Darwinistic version of society where the strong succeed, the strong are in control, and the weak are subservient. The weak just kind of exist here and kind of have more normal lives. Their actual slogan is might makes right. So plan is just basically through brute force, sheer numbers and power, to sweep through Aeternum, decimate all of the corruption and all of the evil, and then take over the other factions, the Syndicate and the Covenant, so that and then bring them under their banner. So that's pretty much the Marauder straightforward. And then the next one is actually going to be the Syndicate, which are kind of a double-edged sword in terms of my interest in them, because on one half, they're the scholarly bunch that are looking to learn more and use history and use technology and stuff like that to their advantage to free Aeternum from the corruption, to free them from all these problems we're running into. But on the other hand, they're also described as like the more skeevy, underhanded, the more rogue-like stab you in the back type organization too, where they're by any means necessary type thing, they will free Aeternum. And so that kind of gives me a kind of a vibe to them, because I'm not necessarily, I don't usually play the more rogue-like, I usually play the more paladinistic players, the more warrior type. So the Marauders to me are more appealing than the Syndicate. But then the third faction is actually going to be the Covenant. So this is your basic religious organization. They believe through the power of the light, they will cleanse Aeternum, that they will get rid of all evilness and wickedness in the land, and they will rule Aeternum through the power of the light, and everyone will be happy and all that. It's not specific whether they have a god that they worship specifically, or it's just the light as a generic worshiping thing. But they do pray and they do worship, and they do, similar to the other organizations, want to cleanse Aeternum of all evil. So they want to use the power of their light, again, to smite all wickedness of evil in Aeternum and make a pure and innocent and perfect version of Aeternum. So those are kind of the three basic factions. They do have their own independent leaders and some other information, so I might dip into that some more. So if you guys want more information about the faction lore specifically, I can definitely find that out and split that up and get you guys more individual information on each of the factions. But the next faction we're going to talk about, and is actually something that's appeared in Aeternum recently, is actually called the Varangian Raiders. So these are an NPC faction. You cannot join them, but they have recently established 3 settlements in Aeternum. And by visiting the settlements, reading on some notes and stuff you can find in these settlements, you actually learn a lot about them, and some of their stuff is very mind-blowing. So as we get to the story portion of it, this will make a little bit more sense, but you're actually, as far as we know, entering and exiting Aeternum is basically impossible. There's this giant storm that circles Aeternum that destroys all incoming vessels and all outgoing vessels. Once you get to Aeternum, if you survive the trip to Aeternum, you cannot leave. It's impossible to get through this storm. But through the lore we found from these Varangian Raiders, they have somehow traveled to and from Aeternum, from mainland Aeternum in some extent, because the people that are here talk about Aeternum as if they have prior knowledge. Like they're saying things like we're here to get a specific artifact that's here in Aeternum. Like somehow they know that these things are here, even though they shouldn't know unless they've been here before to understand this. And not only that, but another incredibly fascinating part about them is they are aware of the corruption, they know about the corrupted, and they have somehow dealt with the corruption in their own way from where they're from. So we do know that the Varangian Raiders are from the north. It's just said they're from the north. They came down to Aeternum from the north. So we don't know if it's another area beyond as far as we've been north, or if it's like an island adjacent to us to the north. But we do know for a fact that everything above where we've been is basically like a dead zone. Like you cannot, the corruption have it so overwhelmed that we as players or as people, you can't go there and come back. You just can't pass through this. It's very similar to the space, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Like there's like 150 miles or something like that of land that you don't go here. Like this is a no zone. But somehow the Varangian Raiders are able to pass through that area. So whether they're from an adjacent island or not is irrelevant, because they're able to pass through that corrupted zone and get down to mainland Aeternum. And again, they have prior knowledge of the corrupted. In fact, in one of their notes, they specifically say, it appears the people of this land are still suffering from the red sickness. So first of all, that caught my eye. They don't call it the corrupted. They call it the red sickness. So they don't have the same knowledge about them as we do, because we know some of the history of the corrupt. We know that they were created by the ancients or discovered by the ancients, things like that. Whereas they appear to not know that stuff. They appear not to have a lot of prior knowledge to the history of Aeternum, just like more recent, like they've been here before for things, because they're here looking for specific items that they believe are here. So they must know something about the island. And then the other thing that caught my eye is the fact that they said still. So apparently for them, they've somehow dealt with the corruption. Like it's almost like as if we traveled to another world and that world was still suffering from the Black Plague. We would say, oh, they're still suffering from the Black Plague. Like that, the still portion of it implies that they no longer have this issue wherever they're from. So this part to me, and this is a spoiler warning, if you haven't seen all of Attack on Titan, gives me very big Attack on Titan vibes, where like the people who live within the city walls kind of live in their own little world. You know, you have all of the Titans outside the walls. They're, you know, indestructible, blah, blah, blah. Like, what do we do? But beyond that, as soon as you leave the mainland of where Attack on Titan takes place, there's entire civilizations that are basically living in like the early 1900s era, where they have automobiles and they have guns and they have all these things. And for them, that's all like ancient history. That's stuff like they don't even interact with or deal with. To them, that's just like folklore, the Titans and the walls and all that kind of stuff. So I'm getting very much so Attack on Titan vibes, where like they're from a more well-developed, more advanced civilization in terms of their fighting forces and stuff like that. And they've somehow eradicated the corruption where they're from. So again, Varangian Raiders are incredibly fascinating. This lore is really cool. And again, it's not something you learn unless you look for it. So I really wanted to talk about this subject here. And that's going to cover the section here on the different factions. Alright guys, in the last part of this video is going to be talking specifically about some of the lore for the story portion of the game. Kind of where we're at now. I know we covered in the very last portion at the end of it, we talked about the Varangian Raiders, which kind of brought us to a current time. But we're going to kind of carry on with that, with explaining to you kind of the motivation for the players, the motivation for the citizens of Aeternum, what we're working towards, what we're trying to prevent, things like that. So jumping right in, I want to let you guys know this is going to be a fairly somewhat spoiler-free. Obviously, I'm going to spoil a little bit of the late game stuff, some of like the stuff you learn later on, because it's imperative to having a good understanding of what's happening in the world. But I'll leave out a lot of the main story portions of this just to keep it so you can learn more about it as you play through it if you're a new player. And then also I want to be able to get players who have kind of breezed through all this and paying attention caught up a little bit on what's happening. So the main antagonist for the story is named Isabella. As you start to play through the game, you'll hear a lot of talk about the Tempest. And the Tempest is actually a person called Isabella. So she has her own specific goal. And we learn later in the game, she's actually attempting to take the corruption and get it off of Aeternum. So she's a corrupted leader. She's kind of one of the heads of the corrupted. And her mission that she was kind of tasked with was taking the corruption, getting it off of Aeternum. Because the problem is there is a giant storm that encompasses all of Aeternum. This storm, we're not quite sure. There's one of two ways the storm came about. The storm was either brewed up by Aeternum itself as a barrier to stop the corruption from leaving, so that it can then use the angry earth and things like that to try to defeat the corruption from within, and stopping it from spreading without to other lands and things like that. Or something very interesting that was part of the reason why I wanted to do this whole video is unless you read a lot of notes and pay a lot of attention to the extracurricular lore in the game, you will never learn this. But there's actually a supposed goddess of the sea that lives on the shores of Aeternum out in the water, who is part of the defense against the corrupted. So this is where it's kind of convoluted. We don't know if Aeternum itself created the storm, or if the sea goddess is the one that brewed up this giant storm to protect Aeternum. So that's something we're still trying to learn about in the game. But not only that, there's a kraken, like an actual kraken, that's floating around out there in the sea as well. That's almost like a guard dog that also destroys a lot of incoming and outgoing ships, preventing them from getting to shore. And another thing, that's another thing. We're not quite sure if the Kraken is its own kind of entity that's just kind of existing out there. If there's only one of them, if there's more of them, we don't really know. or if the sea goddess itself is kind of like the master of the Kraken, and the Kraken's like the goddess's pet. We're not quite sure of, but those are a couple of really cool things to keep in mind as you play through the game, and it's part of the reason why Isabella is having such a hard time getting off of the continent, because she's incapable of she cannot pass through the storm, and she could also not deal with the sea goddess and the Kraken. So we learn later in the game that the box we actually get at the very beginning of the game contains a piece of her soul. So the little box you open in the beginning cutscene you get from the guy with the red eyes, he gives you a piece of her soul, and that was what leads us to Aeternum. So us with our Captain Thorpe, sail to Aeternum, crash land, bing, bing, boom, game starts. But she's after that box. So we as players are attempting to defend this, or like originally get this box. We had to get the box and then protect it from her, because she claims if she's able to recover this box and retain that piece of her soul, that she'll be powerful enough to pass through the storm. So that's kind of the main incentive we have for the campaign as we're playing through this original part of the story. But beyond that, it kind of leads into the future bits of story so it's important to keep in mind that even though she's like super powerful and she's kind of the leader of the corruption right now, she is not like the end all be all. She's kind of the first stage of the game. She was actually corrupted by a being called the Heretic. So not much is known about the Heretic, almost nothing at all, really. We don't know what he or she looks like or it looks like. We just know that based on her notes and her journaling and stuff like that, that she came in contact with this Heretic and was corrupted. And she was actually, like many others, just someone who washed up on shore in Aeternum. Her crew crash landed. You actually get to learn a whole bunch about her crew and all that stuff, and more about her as an individual human and kind of her motivations for what's going on in the game. Again, I don't want to spoil a lot of this portion of it because it's very cool stuff to learn. She becomes corrupted. She becomes a leader of the corruption called the Tempest, and allowing her to escape Aeternum with the corruption and then starting to spread across the world. So pretty straightforward, not a super long portion, the lore portion of this for the story, but I'm hoping it kind of gives you an understanding as you come into the game, kind of gives you what is your motivation for doing what we're doing. And then for players who kind of breeze through a lot of this content like I did the first time, get you kind of up to snuff with what you're doing, what's happening in the dungeon, the last few dungeons of the game, things like that, and get you kind of prepared for the future updates, the new story that's coming forward. So I hope this video is super helpful for you guys. It's kind of long. I was hoping to do it about 20 minutes, but it looks like it's gonna be more about 30 minutes. And I hope it was helpful. I hope you guys enjoyed kind of the more discussion based of this. If you did like the video, please drop a like, subscribe for more videos like this. If you guys want more in-depth videos on specific parts of the lore, I really like this format, this kind of just discussing the lore with you guys, and I would really love to keep doing more of it. So let me know if there's any specific bits of lore you guys are interested in, maybe a little bit more about the races or Isabella's story or things like that. Let me know down in the comments, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.